The birthday candles flickered, my nephew's laughter died, and then Michael roared, "Put it down! You don't deserve to celebrate with us. You're a burden." Gasps echoed down the hallway. Rachel's voice cut in, sharp as glass. "He's right. You're a disgrace." Their parents nodded in unison. "It's time for you to disappear forever." I didn't cry, because it wasn't me who left, it was... Before we get into the reasons why this happened, if you believe that karma always finds a way, subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. I am Anthony Coleman, 72 years old, a retired high school history teacher who still wakes at dawn, as if the bell might ring. The house is quiet now. It has been quiet since my wife slipped from this world last winter, leaving her teacup on the windowsill and a warmth that refused to leave my palms for days. I speak softly because the walls remember her laugh, and because I spent a lifetime teaching boys to listen before they shouted. I raised my son the way I taught my students, steady, patient, relentless in my belief that effort becomes character. Michael came to me with scraped knees and impossible questions, and I gave him everything I knew: how to stand up straight, how to offer your seat, how to read a room before you enter it. When the world felt heavy, I carried it for him. When he asked for help, I did not ask why, I asked when. I paid tuition with lesson plans and overtime after-school coaching, weekend test prep, summer programs where the classroom smelled like chalk and heat. I sold the car I rebuilt with my own hands, cherry red, the color of small rebellions to make a hospital bill disappear. I signed the lease to his first apartment because the landlord respected my handwriting more than his ambition. I told myself it was what fathers did. I told myself love is not a ledger. Michael loved me once. Or maybe he loved the way I steadied the ground beneath his feet. He would call late at night just to tell me about a class he aced, a girl he met, a dream he had about starting something of his own. I would listen, eyes shut, smiling at the ceiling like a fool in love with hope. When he brought Rachel home for dinner, I set the table with my wife's good plates and watched the room brighten around his grin. Rachel, elegant as a magazine ad, polite in the way that keeps you at arm's length. She said all the right things, "Thank you, sir." Dinner was lovely, yet her eyes slid over my thrift store sweater to the empty corners of the living room where money was supposed to hang. Still, I wanted to believe. A father must want to believe because belief keeps the porch light warm. After the wedding, the rhythms changed. It was subtle, like a picture frame nudged a fraction of an inch. Michael's calls came less often, then shorter, then swallowed by some meeting or another. Holidays required scheduling through Rachel, her voice bright, decisive, final. I adjusted. Old men learn to fold themselves smaller, so the young can spread their wings. I brought gifts for my grandson, wooden puzzles, paper kites, a baseball glove that smelled like summers I thought would never end. He ran to me at first, small hands like sparrows. Then Rachel would say, "He's tired, Grandpa." Let him rest smiling as if the words were a favor. The boy hesitated. The room cooled. None of it was enough to call an illness. Just a draft under the door I could not find. I told myself to be patient. I told myself to be kind. I told myself family is a garden, you water it even when the soil drinks slowly. But one afternoon, while I waited on the sidewalk outside their apartment with a bag of groceries and a book about dinosaurs, something tiny cracked. Michael saw me through the glass, lifted a hand half-wave, half apology and mouthed, "Not a good time." The door did not open. It was only a moment, only a glance, only a draft under the door, but the house felt colder that night. The older I grew, the more I understood how love is spelled in sacrifice. I thought Michael would one day see it too. He was the boy who once cried over a broken toy car, and I was the man who stayed up past midnight fixing it with tape and glue until the wheels spun again. But children don't remember the late nights their fathers spend holding the world together. They only remember the spotlight when it's their turn to shine. I remember selling my beloved car, the cherry red one that had been my weekend joy. I used to drive it with my wife through the countryside, windows down, her laughter whipping through the wind. That car was my last tie to those golden days. But when Rachel's hospital bills came after a difficult pregnancy, I did not hesitate. I handed over the keys, signed the papers, and told myself, a car is just metal. A life is everything. Michael never mentioned it again, not even once. No thank you, no late-night call. It was as though the sacrifice was erased the moment the ink dried. To cover Michael's tuition years earlier, I had worked nights tutoring students who barely cared about history. I dragged my old body through crowded classrooms that smelled of sweat and pencil shavings, repeating the same lessons until my throat burned. I gave up sleep, health, and even friendships. My colleagues retired to fishing trips and gardens, while I clung to extra work so my son wouldn't drown in debt. I convinced myself this was love, that someday Michael would look at me and see the foundation beneath his house. I even signed for his first apartment. I remember standing in the landlord's office, pen shaking in my hand. The man looked at me, not Michael, when asking if the rent would be paid. My son stood tall beside me, nodding as if he were the one responsible. I smiled through it. Fathers smile through everything. In those years, I believed we were a team. I thought he saw me as his safety net, his quiet partner. When he met Rachel, I tried to extend that same trust. At dinner, I pulled out the best dishes, polished the forks until they gleamed, poured wine I could barely afford. Rachel complimented the meal, but her eyes told another story, scanning my frayed shirt cuffs, the cracked paint on the walls. She wasn't cruel, not then, just dismissive. And Michael, oh, Michael, he was blinded by love, leaning into her warmth, forgetting the cold hands that built his fire. Even then, I told myself not to worry. Families stretch, families bend. A father doesn't need the center seat at the table, as long as he's still welcome in the room. But the room was shrinking, and I didn't know it yet. The first real sign came at a holiday dinner. Rachel's father clinked his glass and said, "Michael has built such a successful life on his own." My fork paused in the air. I waited for Michael to speak, to correct him, to acknowledge the years of sweat and sacrifice I had poured into his success. Instead, he laughed lightly, basking in the praise, and changed the subject. I chewed my food in silence, the voices around me blurred. It was in that moment I realized love could be rewritten, history could be erased, and even a father could become a footnote in his own son's story. I used to think silence was noble, that if I endured the small cuts, the bleeding would stop. But silence only teaches people that your pain is acceptable. After Michael's marriage, the cracks widened. Phone calls grew scarce, then disappeared altogether. If I wanted to see my son, I had to knock on Rachel's door first. She became the gatekeeper, her voice always bright, always decisive. "It's not a good time, Anthony. They're busy with work." Busy, always busy, but never too busy for her family's parties, their vacations, their endless photographs of smiling faces where my chair was never set. Rachel's parents were polite in public, but politeness can be crueler than outright insult. At dinners, they'd ask if I was still living in the old neighborhood, as though it were a stain. They'd lean in to Michael, praising his drive, his ambition, his ability to provide for Rachel in ways I never could. Each word was a reminder. I was small, he was great, and their daughter had lifted him into a world above me. And Michael? He sat there, nodding, smiling, drinking in their praise like a man starved. He never once said, "My father carried me here." Not once. I watched my own son erase me in real time. The first time it happened publicly, it was Christmas. Rachel's mother admired the apartment, my signature still on the lease, though no one remembered, and she said, "Michael, you've really built this all on your own." My hand tightened around the coffee mug. I waited. I prayed. I begged silently for Michael to tell the truth. But he only smiled. He put his arm around Rachel and said, "Hard work pays off." Laughter followed, glasses clinked, and my name never entered the room. I felt my wife's absence heavier that night. She would have spoken. She would have reminded him. But I cowered that I was remained silent, staring at the blinking lights of their tree, swallowing down the taste of betrayal. My grandson tugged on my sleeve, showing me a toy train. His joy was my only anchor, the reason I stayed seated when everything inside me wanted to walk out. But that silence? That was the moment I began to understand. I wasn't part of their story anymore. I was an inconvenient shadow standing in the corner while they rehearsed the lines of a play where I did not exist. I kept showing up because that's what fathers do. We show up. Even when we're not wanted. I arrived at birthdays with carefully wrapped gifts, holidays with dishes my wife once made, anniversaries with cards I wrote by hand. I told myself if I kept watering the soil, maybe something would bloom again. My grandson was my anchor. The boy's eyes lit up whenever I entered the room. He would run, arms wide, shouting, "Grandpa!" and my chest would swell with a pride words cannot hold. But even that light was dimmed. Rachel's hand would rest gently on his shoulder, guiding him away. "Don't bother, Grandpa. He's tired. She always said it with a smile sweet enough to fool anyone who wasn't me. The boy hesitated, and in hesitation, love learns doubt. One Christmas I arrived early, carrying a tin of cookies baked from my wife's old recipe. The living room glittered with decorations, laughter spilling from every corner. Yet, when I stepped inside, no one rose to greet me. No chair was saved at the table. I hovered at the edge until someone offered a folding chair from the garage, squeezed against the wall like an afterthought. I smiled, pretended it didn't sting, but inside I felt like a guest in the house I had once built with my own hands. Michael barely looked my way. Rachel busied herself with her parents, their laughter filling the room like a chorus. My grandson peeked at me from across the table, mouth stuffed with candy, waving secretly when Rachel wasn't watching. That tiny wave kept me breathing. I told myself family was worth every humiliation. That grief made me cling harder, desperate to keep the last piece of my wife alive through our son. Nights were lonelier without her, and I convinced myself that swallowing Rachel's disdain was a small price to pay if it meant hearing my grandson laugh. But the silence between Michael and me was no longer silence, it was distance. Thick, heavy, suffocating distance. He never asked if I needed anything, never wondered how I managed in the empty house. And still, I convinced myself, family is family. Endure, endure. I had no idea then that endurance would soon be mistaken for weakness, and that they were preparing to strike the cruelest blow of all. The night of my grandson's birthday is carved into my memory like a scar. The hall was buzzing with chatter, balloons drifting against the ceiling, the smell of sugar and frosting thick in the air. Children clapped as candles flickered on the cake I carried forward, my hands trembling not from age, but from pride. For a moment, I let myself believe I still belonged. Then Michael's voice cut through the laughter. "Put it down!" he roared. The words slammed against me harder than any fist. The room froze. My grandson's smile withered mid-breath. My ears rang with disbelief as Michael's face hardened. "You don't deserve to celebrate with us. You're nothing but a burden." Gasps rippled through the guests. I stood there with the cake trembling in my grip, a 72-year-old man holding the last piece of his dignity as if it were made of glass. Rachel rose from her seat, her voice sharp, rehearsed, a blade meant to cut clean. "He's right. You've brought nothing but shame to this family. We don't need you here." The words didn't tremble. They had been practiced. Then, as though on cue, Rachel's parents joined in, heads nodding, voices dripping with finality. "Michael's done enough carrying you. It's time you vanished for good." The chorus echoed in my skull. Guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one defended me. My grandson stared, confusion clouding his young face, his small hands frozen above the table. I looked at Michael, the boy I had raised, the man I had carried, and searched for the son I once knew. All I found was a stranger, standing taller on the ashes of my sacrifices. The cake trembled in my hands. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply set it down on the table, straightened my back, and walked out of the hall. Not a word followed me, not a hand reached out. The night air was cold. My heart was colder. Yet beneath the ice, something stirred, not grief, not anger, but a stillness sharper than either, a silence that promised this story wasn't finished. And though they thought they had erased me, they had only written the first line of a new chapter. After that night, I sat alone in my quiet house, the echo of their words clinging to me like smoke. I told myself not to replay it, but memory has its own hunger. It gnaws at you when the world is silent. So I began to remember, not the betrayal, but the years before the foundation I built with bleeding hands, believing it would hold us together forever. When Michael was young, I carried two burdens, my students and my son. After his mother died, the weight of both nearly crushed me, yet I refused to bend. I rose before dawn to grade essays, then packed Michael's lunch, tying his shoelaces with fingers already stiff from arthritis. At school, I gave my patience to boys who weren't mine, then returned home to a boy who was pouring what little I had left into his homework, his bedtime stories, his restless dreams. Michael was my anchor. His laughter in those early years was my reason for waking. I remember sitting on the porch, watching him race a toy car down the steps, his face glowing as if he'd conquered the world. He would run to me, arms open wide, shouting, "Dad, look, I did it!" And I would clap as though it mattered more than any graduation I'd ever attend. In those moments, grief loosened its grip. My wife's absence didn't feel like a wound, it felt like a debt I could repay by raising him well. I shielded him from hunger, from fear, from every sharp edge I could dull. I hid overdue bills in drawers, worked weekends to pay for things I couldn't afford, smiled even when exhaustion clawed at my bones. When he asked why I looked tired, I told him, because working hard is what men do for their families. He believed me, and I believed him, believed that one day he would remember. But remembering is a choice, and some debts are too easy to forget when they are not yours to carry. That night at the party, when he called me a burden, it was as if he had thrown every sacrifice into a furnace and laughed at the smoke. Yet here in the silence of my house, the truth remains carved into me. I gave him everything. I gave, and still he wanted more. I remember the years when money was nothing more than a shadow that chased me. My teaching salary barely stretched, yet I refused to let Michael see the cracks. He deserved more than the sight of his father breaking under the weight of bills. So I took on tutoring jobs after hours. Weeknights blurred into weekends, my voice hoarse from repeating lessons about battles and revolutions to boys who only cared about passing their tests. My body ached, my hands shook from chalk dust and fatigue, but I endured because every dollar earned meant Michael's future was safeguarded. I convinced myself that exhaustion was a fair trade for his dreams. The hardest sacrifice was selling my car, the cherry red machine I had restored piece by piece with my wife. It wasn't just metal, it was memory. Long drives through the countryside, her hair blowing in the wind, her laughter spilling into the night air, all gone with the stroke of a pen. I told myself I wasn't losing something, I was giving something. Rachel's hospital bills had to be paid, and Michael needed me to stand strong. So I did. I always did. Michael never brought it up again. He never asked what it cost me to hand over those keys. He looked at Rachel, at the healthy baby boy in her arms, and smiled with pride, as though the world had arranged itself perfectly for him. I stood in the background, clapping softly, invisible in my own story. There were nights I'd collapse into the armchair, staring at the empty driveway, listening to the silence of a house without my wife. I told myself I wasn't alone because Michael was out there, building a life I had carved from my own bones. I believed he would understand one day. I believed gratitude would come with age. But gratitude never came, only distance. And so, every sleepless night, every lost memory of my wife tied to that car, every hour spent working while others rested, they became bricks in a wall I didn't know Michael was building between us. Rachel's pregnancy was the storm that nearly drowned me. I still remember the night Michael called, his voice frantic, cracking through the phone. "Dad, we can't afford this. The hospital, the bills. I don't know what to do." I didn't hesitate. Fathers don't hesitate. I told him to focus on Rachel, to keep her calm, that I would take care of the rest. I pulled out the last of my savings. The account I had built slowly over years of skipped vacations and quiet nights in. It was supposed to carry me through old age, to keep food on the table when my body could no longer keep pace. But in that moment, I saw only Rachel's pale face, Michael's shaking hands, the unborn child's fragile heartbeat. So I signed it away. Every dollar, just like I sold the car, just like I worked the nights, just like I always did. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and fear. I remember sitting alone in the waiting room, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles went white. No one sat with me. No one offered comfort. I was too old, too quiet, too invisible. I prayed, not to God exactly, but to my wife, asking her to keep watch over the child I would never hold if fate was cruel. Hours dragged like chains. Then the doctor came out, said the words I longed for. "Mother and baby are fine." Relief nearly buckled me. I wanted to collapse, to weep, to let someone hold me. But there was no one, just me, a hallway, and the weight of knowing I had given away the last of my safety for their future. When Rachel finally left the hospital with the baby in her arms, Michael looked at her with pride, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "We made it." I stood beside them, smiling weakly, my body hollow. He never once said, "Thank you, Dad." Not then, not ever. But I told myself it didn't matter. Gratitude was a luxury. Love was the payment I sought. The problem is, love can be rewritten. Love can be denied. And sacrifice without acknowledgement turns to dust in your throat. That night, walking home from the hospital under the dim glow of streetlights, I carried no money, no savings, no wife, only faith that Michael would remember. But faith is fragile, and memory is cruel. Michael once told me he dreamed of starting his own company. His eyes burned with the same fire I used to see in my students when they discovered a passion worth chasing. He wanted to build something that mattered, something that would carry his name, And just like every other dream he'd ever voiced, I made it my mission to see it through. The banks looked at him and saw risk. They looked at me and saw stability. They trusted my signature more than his enthusiasm. So I signed. I co-signed every loan, every paper that gave him a chance. I mortgaged my comfort, my peace of mind, my future security, for him, always for him. I remember the nights I stayed up reviewing contracts by the dim light of a lamp that hummed louder than my own heartbeat. I wasn't a businessman, but I taught myself the language of numbers and clauses, determined not to let Michael walk blind into traps. I should have been enjoying retirement. Instead, I was building his foundation brick by brick. And when his company finally launched, when people toasted his success, my name was never spoken. At a family dinner, Rachel's father raised a glass and said, "To Michael, a true self-made man." The words stung like salt in an open wound. I looked at my son, waiting for him to correct the lie, to acknowledge the man who held the safety net beneath him. He only smiled, lifted his glass, and said, "To hard work." I felt the room close in on me, the clinking glasses like a chorus of betrayal. I swallowed my anger, sat quietly in the corner, and let them erase me. My wife's picture sat on the mantel behind Michael that night, her smile frozen in time. I wished she were there to remind him, to tell him who had truly carried him. But it was just me, silent and invisible, fading while others applauded. The cruelest part? I wasn't angry at first. I was proud that he stood tall, that he was admired, even if my role was hidden. I convinced myself this was what fathers were meant to do, be the scaffolding that disappears once the building stands. But scaffolding is never meant to be kicked away and called a burden, and that is exactly what I became. In the beginning, my grandson was the light that softened the edges of my loneliness. His laughter spilled into the hollow places of my heart, filling cracks that grief had left behind. He would run to me, arms wide, climbing onto my knees with no hesitation, his small hands tugging at my shirt. "Grandpa, play." Those moments reminded me why I had given everything for the continuation of love through generations. I brought him wooden puzzles, simple toys that made his eyes sparkle with curiosity. I folded paper kites, painted bright colors on their tails, and watched him chase them through the park until his cheeks flushed red. The baseball glove I bought smelled of summers long gone, yet when I placed it in his hands, it felt like the promise of new memories. He laughed, he hugged me, he called me his hero. But Rachel was always there, hovering, her smile too sharp, her voice dipped in sugar. "Don't bother Grandpa, he's tired." She said it so sweetly the first time that even I almost believed her. My grandson hesitated, the way children do when they sense authority tugging against affection. And slowly, visit by visit, the hesitation grew. At family gatherings, he no longer ran to me first. He glanced at Rachel before reaching for my hand, his eyes flickering with silent questions. "Am I allowed?" I saw the confusion take root, saw love being rewritten in real time. Rachel was teaching him boundaries, not of respect, but of distance. One evening, I watched him hold a toy train, glancing between me and his mother. He wanted to share it with me, to place it in my palm. But Rachel's hand on his shoulder anchored him. His little fingers tightened around the toy, and he stayed where he was. The train never crossed the room. My heart broke quietly, invisibly, as I forced a smile to reassure him. Love doesn't vanish in an instant. It fades, step by step, replaced with uncertainty, with lessons whispered by those who want to rewrite the story. I could feel my place shrinking, not because of the child's choice, but because of the mother who wanted to redraw the lines. And yet, I endured. I told myself patience would prevail. That love, once planted, could not be uprooted so easily. I convinced myself that no one, not even Rachel, could erase the bond between a grandfather and his grandson. I was wrong. After my wife died, nights turned into endless corridors of silence. The house that once echoed with her laughter became a tomb where even the ticking clock sounded like a hammer striking stone. I would sit in her chair, tracing the grooves worn into the wood by her hands, whispering conversations to a ghost. Grief is a quiet thief. It doesn't steal all at once. It takes piece by piece, leaving you hollow without realizing how empty you've become. In those hollow nights, I clung to the hope that Michael would be my anchor, that he would call, that he would visit, that he would ask if I'd eaten or needed company. But the phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was Rachel's voice, efficient and brisk. "They're busy, Anthony. Maybe another time." Another time became never. I walked the neighborhood alone, watching other families gather at dinner tables, their windows glowing with warmth. My own house was cold, the curtains drawn tight, the only sound the shuffle of my slippers on hardwood floors. I kept myself occupied with books, with mending old clothes, with cleaning rooms no one would ever use again. Anything to pretend the silence wasn't swallowing me whole. At holidays, I forced myself to show up, to sit at Rachel's table, to endure the polite smiles and hollow questions. They never asked how I was managing. They never wondered if the bills were paid or if the nights were too long. They treated me as though grief had made me irrelevant, a shadow lingering where light was no longer welcome. Still, I endured. Because love does that, it convinces you that humiliation is worth the price if it keeps you tethered to family. But tethering works both ways. It binds you, but it can also strangle you. Every night, I told myself I just needed to last one more day. That if I kept showing up, Michael would remember the man who raised him. That if I kept enduring, Rachel's disdain would soften. But endurance without recognition is not noble. It is slow erasure. And by the time I realized I was being erased, I was already halfway gone in their eyes. When Michael's words at the party cut through me, "You're nothing but a burden," I felt the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made collapse into ash. For days after, I sat alone replaying the reel of my life, watching scenes of love and labor unravel into nothingness. I remembered the mornings I rose before the sun to pack his lunch, the nights I stayed up sewing buttons back onto his shirts so he could look sharp at school. I remembered pawning my watch to cover a utility bill so his lights would never flicker. I remembered handing him the keys to an apartment I paid for, watching his shoulders square with pride as though he had earned it himself. And then I remembered selling my car, my joy, my memories with his mother, all to pay Rachel's bills when she was too fragile to stand. I remembered waiting alone in sterile hospital hallways, praying for them while they built a life on the back of my silence. It all came rushing back, the endless nights, the endless work, the endless giving. I gave time, I gave money, I gave my youth, I gave my health. I gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left to give but my dignity, and still it wasn't enough. They wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. The cruelest part wasn't their words that night. It was the realization that no one stood for me. Not Michael, not Rachel, not her parents. Not a single voice in that crowded room dared to defend the man who had carried them all. I was invisible, a ghost among the living. But grief has a way of hardening into something else. Sitting in my chair that night, staring into the silence of my home, I felt sorrow crystallize into steel. I whispered to myself, not in anger but in clarity, "I will not leave this world erased." That was the moment my silence became a promise, not of forgiveness, not of reconciliation, but of reckoning. The morning after my vow, I sat at the kitchen table with a pile of papers spread before me. The air was cold, the kind that makes old bones ache, but something sharper burned in my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking of how to endure, I was thinking of how to act. I opened a battered metal box I had kept tucked away in the closet. Inside were files, receipts, contracts, the fragments of a lifetime of sacrifice. I ran my fingers over the yellowing edges, each one a reminder of where my money, my sweat, my very life had gone. It was then I found the first weapon. Buried beneath tax records and old lesson plans was the deed to Michael's apartment. My name, not his, was etched in ink that had not faded. The landlord had trusted me, not him, all those years ago. And though I had paid every installment, Michael had walked around claiming it as his own. He had hosted dinners there, bragged about providing for his family, while my signature quietly bore the weight of truth. I held the paper in trembling hands, my pulse hammering like a drum. They had called me a burden. They had told me to disappear. Yet here it was the proof that I was the very foundation beneath their comfort. Without me, their walls would crumble. For the first time since that night, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not joy, not rage, clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you realize the storm they unleashed had only revealed the ground you still stood on. I folded the deed carefully, placed it in a folder marked with a single word, receipts. They thought they had buried me, but the ground they stood on still belonged to me. Once the apartment deed was secured in my folder, I dug deeper. Paper by paper, line by line, the truth of my sacrifices unfolded like a ledger carved into bone. And then I found the second weapon, one they had no idea still lay in my possession. The life insurance policy. Rachel's name was listed as the beneficiary. Yes, but the policyholder, the true owner of the contract, was me. My signature had opened it. My payments had kept it alive. For years, I had written those checks quietly, believing it was one last safeguard for Michael's family after I was gone. A final act of love, ensuring they would never struggle the way I had. I stared at the page, the numbers swimming before my eyes. Thousands upon thousands of dollars sat in those lines. Money they counted on. Money they had probably already planned into their future. And yet all of it was tethered to me. With a single decision, I could sever the rope they clung to. I imagined Rachel's voice, so sharp that night, declaring I was nothing but shame to their family. I imagined Michael, standing tall, certain he had outgrown me. They believed I was powerless. But here in my hands was the proof that their comfort, their security, their illusions of independence were all bound to the man they had tried to erase. I felt no anger, only an odd stillness, like standing in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. They had written me off as a burden, but the ink on these papers told a different story, one I would let speak for itself. I placed the policy into the folder beside the deed, 2 weapons, 2 receipts. And with every document I uncovered, the burden they accused me of being grew lighter, while theirs grew heavier. They just didn't know it yet. The more I searched, the more I realized the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. Years of documents, receipts, contracts, each one a quiet witness to the life I had carried on my back. I thought they were scraps of paper, but in the light of betrayal, they became weapons sharper than knives. I pulled out tuition receipts, thick stacks of them, dated and signed, covering every semester Michael had studied. The ink might have faded, but the numbers hadn't. Thousands upon thousands of dollars, carved out of nights when I should have been sleeping, scraped together from tutoring sessions that drained my body dry. Every sheet screamed the same truth. Michael did not build himself. I built him. Next came the hospital records. My name printed on invoices, my payments clearing debts that would have broken them before they had even begun. I could still feel the sting of those fluorescent hospital lights, the smell of disinfectant, the ache in my chest as I signed checks I could not afford. And yet, not a single thank you had ever passed their lips. Even the apartment lease was still there, copies of payments made month after month. The landlord had only ever trusted me. Michael lived under a roof I had secured, a roof he claimed as his own while erasing me from the story. As I laid each paper on the table, the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't just sacrifice, it was evidence. Proof that I had been the spine of every chapter in Michael's life, while he stood on stages and declared himself self-made. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, sliding them into the folder labeled receipts. With every page, the weight in my chest eased. They thought they had silenced me, but these documents would speak louder than any words I could ever shout. History remembers what is written down, and I had kept every page. I sat at the table, surrounded by stacks of proof, and felt something I hadn't in years: clarity. Betrayal has a way of burning away illusions, leaving only what cannot be denied. Michael and Rachel had erased me from their story, but the law had not. Paper does not lie. Signatures do not forget. I stared at the deeds, the policies, the receipts. To anyone else they were just records, but to me they were the bones of a life I had sacrificed. They told the story Michael refused to speak, a father who sold his car, who drained his savings, who worked nights, who gave his very breath so his son could rise. And the cruel irony was that the higher he rose, the more he looked down on me. But now, with every document, the balance shifted. For the first time, I saw that I wasn't powerless. I wasn't a burden. I was the ledger they never expected me to open. And once opened, it could not be closed again. I whispered into the silence of my kitchen. They wanted me gone, but they are standing on ground I still own. The words didn't come with anger. They came with calm, the kind of calm a judge must feel when the verdict is clear. For years, I had believed love was enough, that if I endured, if I kept giving, one day they would remember. But memory can be twisted, gratitude can be erased. Only records endure. I pressed my hand flat against the folder labeled receipts. The paper was cool beneath my skin, but it burned like justice waiting to be served. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to beg. When the time came, these papers would speak for me, and their voices would be undeniable. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of quiet that suffocates. This was a purposeful silence, the stillness of a man preparing for something inevitable. Each morning I rose with a list. Each evening I laid my head down with one more step completed. I was no longer drifting in grief. I was moving with precision. I visited the bank first. The clerk looked at me over her glasses as I confirmed the details of the life insurance policy. Yes, the beneficiary could be changed. Yes, as the policyholder, I had full control. She didn't know the storm that raged beneath my calm voice. To her, I was just another old man taking care of business. To me, it was the moment I realized Rachel's future rested on my signature. Next came the real estate office. I sat with a lawyer younger than my son, his hair slick, his pen tapping against the desk as he flipped through the apartment deed. "Your name is the only one that matters here, Mr. Coleman," he said. The words struck deeper than he knew. For years, I had been told I was nothing, a burden. Yet here, in black and white, I was the foundation of their home. Every appointment, every signature, every quiet nod of confirmation was like reclaiming a piece of myself. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Anger burns too hot, too quick. This was colder. This was deliberate. At night, I spread the documents across my table, arranging them in neat rows. The deed, the insurance policy, the receipts for tuition, the hospital bills, the lease payments. Each one a chapter in the book they tried to close on me. I traced my fingers over the papers, whispering to my wife's picture on the mantel. They thought I was gone, but I'm still here, and I'm not finished. For the first time in years, I didn't feel erased. I felt seen by the truth, by the law, by the records they could never deny. And slowly a plan began to take shape. Not revenge, not cruelty, just balance. Just a reckoning written in ink long before they betrayed me. Before unveiling the truth, I wanted to test its weight. A weapon must be measured before it is drawn. So I chose someone I trusted, a family friend who had known Michael since he was a boy. We sat across from each other at a diner, the hum of conversation around us, the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon hanging in the air. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of tuition receipts, hospital payments, and the apartment deed. The friend's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. His lips parted, but for a long moment no words came out. Finally he whispered, "All these years," and he never said a thing. I shook my head. He let them believe he was self-made. He let them erase me. The friend's gaze hardened. "People need to know, Antony. They should see who really carried him." And so the whispers began. Quietly at first, like the rustle of leaves before a storm, the friend spoke to another, who spoke to another. Soon the truth was trickling into the same social circles that had once praised Michael's independence. A different picture began to form, one where his so-called success leaned entirely on the shoulders of the man he had humiliated. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply listened as word reached me in fragments. I heard his father paid for everything. He's not the man we thought he was. Imagine erasing the person who built your life. Each whisper was a stone in the foundation of something larger. Their polished image was beginning to crack, not by my hands forcing it, but by the quiet power of truth. At home, I added another note to the folder marked receipts. The world has begun to remember. It wasn't revenge yet, not the full strike, but it was the first shadow of the storm to come. By the end of that week, the plan had crystallized into something sharp, something final. I no longer felt like a man wandering through grief. I felt like a judge who had gathered every piece of evidence and was ready to deliver the verdict. I sat at my table one last time, the folder open before me. The deed, the insurance policy, the tuition receipts, the hospital bills. Every sacrifice I had made, every dollar and drop of sweat, every signature that kept their world standing, it was all there. A record of truth that not even Michael's pride or Rachel's venom could erase. For years, I had endured their silence, their dismissals, their slow erasure of my place in the family. I thought patience would heal, that kindness would soften their contempt. But kindness without respect becomes weakness. Patience without recognition becomes erasure. And I was done being erased. I whispered the words aloud, steady and clear. I will not confront them with shouting. I will confront them with silence, contracts, and consequences. It was no longer about winning their love or reclaiming their approval. Those were illusions, long buried with my wife. This was about balance, about letting the truth stand naked in the light and allowing the weight of their own actions to crush them. I closed the folder and slid it into my briefcase. My lawyer's number was already in my pocket, a single call away from setting everything in motion. Michael had called me a burden. Rachel had called me a disgrace. Her parents had demanded I vanish. They thought their words had ended me. But words vanish. Paper endures. The next chapter would not be written in anger. It would be written in ink, in law, and in silence, sharp enough to cut deeper than any scream. The first strike was silent. No shouting, no scenes, just ink on paper. I sat in my lawyer's office, the blinds drawn against the afternoon Sunday. He read the deed aloud, confirming what I already knew. The apartment Michael called his own was still mine in the eyes of the law. My name was the foundation beneath its walls, not his, and with a single signature I could reclaim it. The pen felt heavy in my hand. For decades, pens had been my tools of sacrifice, signing checks, signing loans, signing away pieces of my life so Michael could build his. But this time, the ink wasn't sacrifice. It was reclamation. I signed. The lawyer stamped the papers, his voice calm and professional as he said, "It's done. The property is officially yours alone." The words settled into me like stone. For the first time in years, I didn't feel erased. I felt present, solid. Within days, the eviction notice was served. I imagined Michael's face as he read it, confusion blooming into panic. The walls he thought he owned were no longer his. The floor beneath Rachel's polished shoes had been pulled out from under her. They had mocked me as a burden, but now they were the ones scrambling for ground. I didn't need to be there to hear the arguments that surely followed, the blame hurled back and forth. I didn't need to see the way Rachel's parents looked at Michael, their golden son-in-law suddenly revealed as a fraud. All I needed was the silence of my own home, the steady beat of my heart, and the knowledge that the first domino had fallen. They thought the birthday party was the end of my story. They were wrong. It was only the beginning of theirs, the unraveling. And this time, I was the one holding the thread. The second strike was colder, sharper, the kind that severs lifelines. I returned to the bank where the life insurance policy had sat quietly for years, hidden in plain sight. The clerk greeted me with the same polite smile as before, unaware of the storm her paperwork was about to unleash. I laid the documents on the counter, steady and deliberate. "I'd like to make a change of beneficiary," I said. Her pen scratched against the form as if it were any ordinary request. But it was not ordinary, it was surgical. Rachel's name, once written in confident strokes, was crossed out. In its place, I listed a charity, one my wife used to support. I signed my name at the bottom, my hand steady as stone. The clerk stamped the papers. "That's it, Mr. Coleman. The change is official." I thanked her and walked out into the daylight. The sun felt different, warmer, cleaner, as though even the sky understood that a balance had shifted. Somewhere across town, Rachel still believed the safety net was hers. She still believed the future was secure, that my life savings would one day cushion her family. But the truth was already written. The rope she thought she clung to had been cut clean. I imagined the day she would discover it, the shock in her eyes, the tremor in her voice, the way her world would collapse in a single line of ink. And I would not need to raise my voice or lift a finger. Paper would do the work for me. With the apartment reclaimed and the insurance redirected, 2 pillars of their comfort were gone. They had laughed at me, erased me, branded me a burden. But now, without me, their foundation was crumbling. I walked home lighter than I had in years. Not because I had taken something from them, but because I had reclaimed what was always mine to decide. My silence was no longer weakness. It was strategy, and they had no idea how much further it would go. The third strike wasn't about papers or signatures, it was about truth. And truth, once set free, can never be caged again. I gathered copies of the receipts, the tuition payments, the hospital bills, the records of every sacrifice I had made. Neat, undeniable, irrefutable. I sealed them in an envelope and addressed it to Rachel's parents. No note, no explanation, just the cold weight of facts. Days later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that the envelope had arrived. Rachel's parents sat in their immaculate dining room, opening it between glasses of wine and polished silver. At first, they must have thought it was some mistake. Why would their proud son-in-law's father send them bills and records from decades past? But as the pages turned, the truth unfolded. Their golden son-in-law had not built his life from ambition alone. He had been carried. I imagined the silence that must have fallen over that table, the pause of forks midair, the slow realization that every story Michael had told, every boast he had made about being self-made, was built on my back. That the man they had mocked as a burden had been the very reason their daughter and grandson lived in comfort. Soon after, whispers reached me. Rachel's parents were furious not at me, but at him. Their pride had been punctured, their image tarnished. They had paraded Michael as proof of their daughter's wise choice, and now they saw the cracks. And in families like theirs, Cracks are not forgiven, they are condemned. I didn't need to confront Michael. I didn't need to be in the room. The truth had walked in without me, and it had spoken louder than I ever could. My silence was their undoing. For the first time in years, I allowed myself a smile. Small, quiet, fleeting but real. The kind of smile a man makes when he realizes history, at last, is being corrected, and history was only just beginning to remember. The fourth strike didn't need my hand at all. It spread on its own like cracks running through glass. Once the truth left my folder and reached their polished world, it became a storm I no longer had to steer. Rachel's parents, once so proud, began to withdraw. Their calls to Michael grew shorter, their invitations fewer. The glances they gave him at gatherings were no longer warm with approval, but sharp with suspicion. Their friends, the ones who used to applaud Michael's success, started whispering. I could feel it in the silence that stretched across dinners, in the way their smiles faltered when my name was quietly mentioned. Reputation is a fragile thing. For years, Michael and Rachel had polished theirs until it gleamed. But truth has a way of dulling even the brightest shine. Every whisper carried the same message. He wasn't the man he claimed to be. His success wasn't earned, it was inherited, carried, bought with the sacrifices of the father he humiliated. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't even need to listen. The damage was happening in places I couldn't see, in conversations I wasn't part of. And that was the beauty of it. My silence was louder than any argument could ever be. I imagined Michael walking into rooms where he was once celebrated, only to feel the weight of eyes avoiding his. I imagined Rachel's smile, once so sharp, struggling to hold steady as the ground beneath her tilted. Their allies were slipping away, not because I had demanded it, but because truth corrodes loyalty when it's built on lies. I sat at my kitchen table, the folder of receipts beside me, and poured myself a cup of tea. For the first time in years, it tasted sweet, not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to fight. The world was beginning to see them for who they truly were, and I hadn't even raised my voice. It didn't take long before Michael reached out. The calls began with hesitation late at night, his name flashing across my phone screen like a ghost I had no reason to answer. I let it ring. Again. And again. Each time, I sat in my chair, staring at the silence, letting him taste the void he had forced on me for years. Finally, I answered. His voice was smaller than I remembered. Dad, I don't know what's happening. They're pulling away. Rachel's parents, our friends. It's like everyone turned on us. I listened, but said nothing. Let him squirm in the quiet he once forced on me. Please, he continued, desperation leaking through the line. I know we've had issues, but you're still my father. I need your help. I almost laughed at the word help. For decades, that was all I had given him. Help, sacrifice, support, until the very marrow of my bones had been spent. And now, when the walls were caving in, he remembered my existence. Not out of love, out of need. Now you remember I exist. I finally said, my voice calm, steady. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by his uneven breathing. Dad, please. But I ended the call, not in anger, not in cruelty, in finality. Some doors must close without a slam, so the echo cannot be mistaken for invitation. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in years. Michael's voice, once sharp with humiliation, now cracked with desperation. It was not victory I felt. It was balance. The scales had begun to even. For once, it was not me begging to be seen. It was him. The next knock came not from Michael, but from Rachel. She arrived at my door one afternoon, her voice already raised before I even opened it. Her polished confidence was cracked, her eyes flashing with anger that barely hid her fear. How could you do this? She demanded. Do you know what you've done to us? We've lost everything, our home, our security, our standing. You're destroying your own family. I let her words crash against me like waves against stone. For years, I had endured her barbed politeness, her subtle humiliations. Now the mask was gone, and all that remained was desperation. Calmly, I invited her inside. On the table sat the folder, neat, organized, undeniable. I slid it toward her. She opened it, her fingers trembling as she flipped through each page. Tuition receipts, hospital bills, lease payments, the insurance documents, proof of every sacrifice I had made, every dollar I had bled for them. When her eyes met mine again, they were wide not with guilt, but with disbelief. This is cruelty, she whispered. I shook my head. No, Rachel, This is record keeping. Her mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time since I had met her, Rachel had nothing to say. She closed the folder, her hands shaking, and left without another word. The sound of the door closing was softer than her voice had ever been, yet it carried more weight than all her years of sharp remarks. I sat back in my chair, the silence settling around me like a cloak. It wasn't joy I felt, nor triumph. It was truth finally acknowledged, even if only by her eyes. She could call it cruelty, but deep down she knew it was justice. And justice, once awakened, does not return to sleep. The confrontation I had avoided for so long finally came not in private, but in public, where whispers had already prepared the stage. It was a family gathering. Distant cousins, old friends, neighbors' faces that had once looked at Michael with admiration now regarded him with something colder, something sharper. I arrived quietly. No announcement, no explanation. I didn't need one. The weight of truth had already arrived before me. Michael stood in the center, trying to smile, trying to pretend the ground wasn't crumbling. Rachel clung to his arm, her smile stretched thin. But the eyes around them told the story people knew. The myth of the self-made man had collapsed. When Michael saw me, his smile faltered. He stepped forward, his voice low but shaking. "Dad, please, we need to talk." The words were desperate, but he tried to hide them beneath a veneer of control. I said nothing. Silence was my reply. Silence, heavier than any insult, sharper than any shout. Rachel's parents shifted uncomfortably. Their pride was gone, their confidence shattered. They had mocked me once, called me a burden. Now they couldn't even meet my eyes. The room was suffocating with truth, and all I had done was walk in. Michael's voice broke, louder this time, carrying through the hall. "Please, Dad, I'm begging you." His hands trembled, his face pale. The boy I had raised, the man who had humiliated me, was now pleading in front of the same crowd that once applauded him. Still, I remained silent. Around us, whispers filled the air. He built his life on his father's back. How could he do that to the man who gave him everything? No wonder his world is falling apart. Michael's eyes brimmed with desperation, searching for even a flicker of forgiveness in my face. But I offered none. Silence was my verdict, and the crowd delivered the sentence. For the first time, it was not me who was invisible. It was him. The final strike was not loud. It was not cruel. It was deliberate, precise, the closing of a ledger. I met with my lawyer one last time. The folder labeled Receipts sat between us, its edges worn from my hands, but its contents unshakable. One by one, I signed the papers that would sever Michael and Rachel from everything they thought was theirs. The apartment, once their pride, was transferred fully back into my possession, not for me to keep, but for me to decide its fate. The life insurance policy, once their safety net, was redirected permanently to charities my wife had cherished. Every asset, every thread of security they had leaned on, was cut away not out of spite, but out of balance. My lawyer glanced at me as the final paper slid across the desk. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Coleman? You're leaving them with nothing." I nodded. "Number, I'm leaving them with exactly what they gave me." The stamp came down, sharp and final. The folder closed. The ledger balanced. I walked out of the office lighter than I had in decades. The weight I had carried years of sacrifice, humiliation, silence was no longer mine. I had passed it back, neatly packaged, sealed with the truth they had chosen to forget. Somewhere across town, Michael and Rachel still believed they could repair their image, still clung to the hope that their world could be patched together. But while they scrambled, I had already written the ending. Their foundation was gone, their lifeline severed, their safety stripped bare. I didn't need to watch their collapse. I didn't need to hear their cries. Justice doesn't demand an audience. It simply exists. As I stepped into the evening air, the sky streaked with fading light, I whispered to myself, "This isn't revenge. This is a receipt." The first time Michael tried to apologize, his voice cracked through the phone like static. "Dad, I'm sorry for everything." The words came halting, unsure, as though he thought they alone could rebuild what he had burned. I listened in silence, letting the weight of his desperation settle between us. "Sorry? Sorry for calling me a burden in front of strangers? Sorry for years of silence? For erasing my sacrifices? For watching Rachel and her family humiliate me while he stayed quiet?" A single word could not repay decades of debt. "Apologies don't repay receipts," I finally said. My voice was calm, steady, colder than anger. sharper than grief. Michael stammered on the other end, but I ended the call before his excuses could spill out. For the first time in years, I felt no ache in my chest. No longing for his approval, no hunger for his recognition. The ledger was balanced. He had given me erasure. I had returned him truth. And now we stood on equal ground. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam curling into the quiet air. It tasted different than before, lighter, almost sweet, not because of sugar, but because of release. I no longer carried the weight of waiting for Michael to see me. I no longer begged to be acknowledged. I existed, whole and unshaken. Without his validation, the house was still empty. My wife's absence still lingered, but the silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like freedom. I had given him everything. And now, finally, I had given myself back to me. Rachel's parents keep their distance now. Once, they looked at me with disdain, as though my presence lowered the air in the room. Now, they avoid my eyes altogether. They cannot erase the truth I placed in their hands. They cannot unsee the receipts, the records that proved their polished son-in-law was standing on foundations he did not build. When I pass them at community gatherings, their smiles are thin, brittle, polite words forced through tight lips. "Mr. Coleman, how are you?" They never linger for answers. Their shame is not for me, it is for themselves, for believing the lie, for mocking the man who carried the weight of the life they admired. I feel no need for their approval anymore. Once, I would have clung to any scrap of respect, would have swallowed humiliation just to stay tethered to family. But tethering is not the same as belonging, and I no longer crave their table, their glances, their hollow praise. Let them whisper. Let them pretend. Their opinions are dust to me now, because I have something they will never understand. Peace that comes from no longer needing to prove my worth. For years, I thought family's love was something I had to earn, something I had to buy with sacrifice and silence. Now I see it clearly. Love given with conditions is not love. It is debt, and I have paid my debts in full. I walk away from their shadowed stairs with my head high, my steps unburdened. Their shame is their own. Their silence is their punishment. And I am finally free from the weight of needing to matter to them. It was my grandson who came to me next, not Michael, not Rachel. A quiet knock on my door one Saturday morning, his small frame standing there, with eyes too heavy for a child. He clutched the same toy train he once hesitated to share with me years ago. "Grandpa, can I stay for a while?" he asked. His voice trembled, but his feet were already inside before I could answer. I made him cocoa, the way I used to for Michael when he was young. We sat at the table, the silence between us softer than the kind I had lived with for years. Finally, he spoke. "Mom says you don't like us anymore. Dad says you're mad, but I don't believe them." I studied his face, the same spark Michael once had, before pride and Rachel's family dimmed it. "I don't hate you, son. I never could. I just needed to step away from what was hurting me." He nodded slowly, as though he understood more than a child should. Then he placed the toy train in my hand, just as he had wanted to all those years ago. "I want you to keep it." The weight of that little train nearly broke me. Not from sadness, but from the reminder that innocence still existed, that not everything had been poisoned. We spent the day together flying kites in the park, laughing at the wind, chasing shadows until the sun dipped low. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of joy that wasn't laced with sacrifice or humiliation. It was simple, pure, real. When Rachel came to fetch him, her face was tight with anger, but my grandson hugged me hard before leaving. "I'll come back, Grandpa," he whispered, and I knew then that even if I had lost my son, I hadn't lost everything. Love had survived, fragile but alive, in the heart of a child who saw me not as a burden, not as shame, but simply as Grandpa. That was enough. My life is quieter now, but the quiet has changed. It is no longer the silence of abandonment, it is the silence of peace. I rise with the sun, make my tea, and sit by the window where my wife's teacup once rested. The emptiness is still there, but it doesn't hurt the way it used to. It feels more like space, room to breathe, room to live on my own terms. I spend afternoons walking through the park, watching children chase kites, their laughter carried on the wind. Sometimes my grandson joins me, and we talk about dinosaurs, trains, or the dreams he hasn't yet learned to be ashamed of. Those are the moments that remind me why I endured as long as I did. Not for Michael, not for Rachel, but for the possibility that love could survive beyond them. Evenings are mine again. I read books I never had time for when I was working 3 jobs. I tend a small garden, outback tomatoes, basil, a stubborn rose bush that keeps blooming no matter how rough the seasons are. I like to think I'm a bit like that rose bush, scarred, weathered, but still standing, still blooming in my own way. For years I believed my worth depended on being needed, that my sacrifices were the only proof of my love. Now I know better. My worth exists in the breath I take, in the life I live, in the quiet joy of a day that belongs only to me. I am no longer the shadow at the edge of their celebrations. I am no longer waiting for a call that never comes. I am no longer begging for a seat at a table where I am unwelcome. I live, not in their story, but in my own. And that, finally, is enough. Sometimes, when the house is still, I let myself remember that night, the birthday party where they tried to bury me alive. I see Michael's face, twisted with contempt, Rachel's voice slicing through the room, her parents nodding like a jury that had already passed sentence. I hear the laughter dying, the gasps, the silence that followed me out the door. For a long time, that memory felt like a wound that wouldn't close. But now, it feels different. It feels like the starting point of something I had needed all along. Their cruelty freed me from the chains I had wrapped around myself, chains of obligation, of endless sacrifice, of begging for scraps of acknowledgement. They thought they had humiliated me. They thought they had broken me. But all they did was reveal the truth, that I had given enough. And it was time to stop giving. I whisper to myself sometimes, sitting in the garden as the sun dips low. They buried me that night, but I walked out breathing. And every day since has been proof that survival is its own kind of justice. My life is not grand. It is not filled with riches or applause. But it is mine. Mine in a way it hasn't been since I first became a father, since every decision I made was for someone else. Now, I decide for me. The wound has become a scar, and the scar is a reminder not of pain, but of strength. They could not erase me. They could not end me. And no matter how much they tried to make me vanish, I am still here, still standing, still breathing, still free. It was Michael who came to me at last, stripped of pride, stripped of certainty. He stood on my porch like a man who had finally seen the wreckage of his own making. His voice was low, trembling, when he spoke. "Dad, I've lost everything. Please, help me." For a moment, I studied him, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, the man who had told me to disappear. His eyes searched mine, desperate for forgiveness, for rescue, for the father he thought would always bend. I let the silence stretch between us, silence heavy as stone, silence that once crushed me but now belonged to me. Then I spoke. "This isn't revenge, Michael. This is a receipt." His face collapsed, as if the words themselves had taken the ground from under him. He tried to speak, but no sound came. All the arguments, all the excuses, all the pride he once wrapped himself in, they dissolved into nothing. I stepped back, my hand resting lightly on the door. "I gave you everything," I said softly, "and you chose to erase me. Now you live with what you wrote." I closed the door, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with finality. The sound was not loud, yet it echoed in my chest like a verdict delivered. For the first time, I did not feel small in his presence. I did not feel erased. I felt whole. The balance was complete. And Michael, left standing in the fading light, finally understood what it meant to be truly alone. The end did not come with fireworks or applause. It came with quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like a door closing softly, sealing the past where it belongs. I live simply now. Mornings with tea by the window, afternoons tending to my stubborn rose bush, evenings with books that keep me company better than most people ever did. My grandson visits when he can, his laughter filling the corners of my house with echoes of hope. He doesn't ask about the past. He only asks if I'll fly kites with him, and I always say yes. Michael and Rachel fade further from my life with each passing day. No more calls, no more letters, no more attempts to claw back what they lost. Their absence is not a wound, it is a relief. A freedom I never thought I would taste. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, I think back to the moment they tried to erase me, the night of the birthday candles. I remember how it felt to stand there with the cake trembling in my hands, the shame heavy as stone. But then I remember what followed, the folder of receipts, the signatures, the silence that became my greatest weapon. And I realize that night was not my ending. It was my beginning. I gave them everything, and when they threw me out, I took only what was mine, my dignity, my truth, my peace. I do not forgive them. I do not wish them well. I do not look back. I walk forward lighter, freer, unburdened, and in the garden of my quiet life, I finally bloom.